Welcome to the IPX True North podcast, where we connect people, processes, and tools.
Welcome back to another True North podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Anderson. I'm joined today by Dr. Nate Hartman. Nate, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. And today, we're gonna devote an entire episode to a topic we have touched on multiple times, and I think there's a reason for that. It's workforce development, and it's training and it's education, multiple levels, and what that means from your perspective, and mine. This one's probably an episode where you're going to see me be a little more animated and maybe a little more on the offense side instead of defense, because I feel like a lot of political leaders, a lot of state, federal, a lot of industrial business owners, CEOs, presidents, the C-suite level, they all talk about the need for workforce development and what we're going to do and how we should do it and why we should do it and why it's so important. But quite honestly, many of them do nothing, or what they do is poor. It's very limited. But there's an investment of obviously the finance side, but also of time,
right,
to adequately have a workforce development program for your entire workforce. And the reason I say that is a lot of companies, they'll spend a small amount of budget on a salaried development and or training. But when it comes to our full workforce and having a common language with a common knowledge of a subject or a certification or a standard, that doesn't mean everyone in the workforce has to be certified. But having a common knowledge across our sites, our workforce, I see that as being lacking. So this one is very, as you can see, important topic to me. But where do you think we are today when it comes to workforce development, training, and education, and where do we need to go?
That's a very good question. and again, like so many of ours in this series, it's multifaceted. And the answers that I'm going to give you are they may not be relevant to every geography or to every company or to every sector. So I think one of the things so I suppose that's my disclaimer at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Right? But one of the things I think we have to think about is what kinds of jobs are we going to see? Job being kind of this all-encompassing word. What kind of jobs are we going to see going forward in the future? In one of our previous podcasts, we talked about production capacity and supply chains coming back to the U.S. As opposed to being, maybe majority global and international, and then just having finished product shipped back here. We've talked about the idea that, we might see more raw material processing, more, midway assembly, maybe even final assembly or what have you done here. Many communities around the country are taking a look at what they feel is their business development ecosystem, their entrepreneurial ecosystem. Indiana's no different in that regard, as well as our neighboring states. They're all looking at this, right? But when it comes down to it, if we're going to make that sort of a transformation, I think we have to think about and probably come to grips with things being different today than they were, say, 50 years ago or 75 years ago, when we started to say, globalize our supply chains, right? Our population centers are not what they were, right? There's been a migration around the United States, right? And what used to be considered, for example, the industrial Midwest no longer has the largest population for producing things, right? Various states have different socio-political, socioeconomic climates for how they do business. And so, everything's from tax rates to educational policy to, state house politics and everything in between influences workforce education. I also think we need to look at workforce education as not a singular topic or a singular thing. It's a much more, again, I'll come back to our word ecosystem. It's a much more ecosystem driven, much more longitudinal kind of a process. For a lot of people, again, historically, people thought about workforce development as one of two things: either training high school graduates in whatever the local plant needed them to know in order to become factory workers there, or to become, say, entry-level clerical or healthcare or food service or what have you employees, right?
Right.
Or it was a situation where a company might look at it as whatever their existing workforce was and give them training. However, in the last 10 to 20 years, everything from, changes in economy to changes in medical technologies to changes in the way people work have resulted in people living longer.
Right.
People, proportionally speaking, are now working longer at times into their lifetime. We used to have a fairly steady turnover rate, right? Yeah. Somebody would work for, say, 30 years and they would retire. Well, some people are now, it's more common, I think, at times now to find someone who has worked for 40 years, maybe even 50 years, not necessarily at the same company or even at the same kind of a job role, but their working life, thus to some degree their tax-paying life, has been longer. We're also seeing, I think, a situation where as our technologies have evolved and our products that we want as a consuming public have become more advanced, even as our production methods for certain things have become more advanced, we're seeing a need for changing the entry-level knowledge that a worker might have. I also think there is a change happening. It has started recently. I don't think it has run its course yet. And so it's hard to say how this is going to turn out. But for the longest time, for example, I will turn 50 years old this year. People of my generation and, probably the generation before and probably even the generation after, we were instructed to go to college because statistically speaking, that was the best path for us in terms of career development, in terms of quality of life, in terms of a lot of things. We're starting to see people doubt that proposition. And I don't mean doubt it as in just simple skepticism. I mean doubt it with also data to back up their
Right.
their suppositions, right? And so it now begs the question: what is the sort of formalized education that people need to be contributing members of our society?
Where's that data coming from? I'd like to peel that onion back a little bit. So when you say we now have this data and experience, and obviously we've discussed this, and I kind of know where the answer is going to go, but for our listeners, there's a lot out there that's really kind of giving us a shift in trajectory.
Yeah.
Or maybe a new column, maybe an option. But I was right there with you. I was told, I think as a freshman in high school, pick a career. Now, as a freshman, I struggled to pick which Pop-Tart I was going to have in the morning, at times as a freshman. Pick a career, and then that's what you're going to end up doing. You're going to finish high school. You're going to take these classes. If you're going to go to college or you go to military, as that's kind of where I was. That's where I was pointed. And I chose West Point at the time, got injured, and I ended up, sticking around and getting an apprenticeship. Many people know my story, and went to college at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But it never changed from that moment
Right.
in the library at, small little rural school. Pick your career based off of static data. So they're giving you data. They're saying this is potentially what the salary is going to be. In order for you to get this is what you must do.
Yeah.
And I believed it.
Right. And to be fair, I think a lot of people believe
Yeah.
that. And I don't want to give the impression that that was good or that that was bad.
Yeah.
To me, it's not a binary good and bad.
Yeah.
I think it's really more of an evolutionary kind of a thing. And so to your point, where does the data come from? Well, I think you can look at a number of sources, everything from population statistics and where certain concentrations of certain parts of the population either are or are not. And that could be everything on an economic scale to a geographic location, to GDP and the like. So I think so you can look at that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You can also look at, for example, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which is a federal source that looks at projections of where certain careers may go, how many we might need. And they show everything from, pluses to minuses in terms of we might need, plus several hundred to minus, several hundred, right? So it gives you a broad indication of where certain career areas might be headed in the future. But I also think, and these are, good or bad, I think we see a lot of the anecdotal ones where we've seen certain individuals be monetarily successful without having gone to college or having dropped out of college, right? Mm-hmm. Or even not even finished high school. And so to me, this isn't necessarily an infomercial for stay in school, but it's more of the idea that what we have historically looked at as formalized education may not necessarily be the same way we should do it in the future, whether it's the form that it takes, the duration that it takes, the topics that it covers, and so on.
Right.
I think that's where we need to look, is because we have, and I think so much of this, unfortunately, is anecdotal, right? That being said, there are certain parts of the U.S. in this case where in certain regions of the country the population is growing, and in certain regions of the country the population is not growing. Regardless, we often have employers in those areas saying, I need people to do X, fill in the blank, and I can't find qualified people to do X.
And I want to interrupt you there. And I think part of the problem, from my perspective, is those companies, I'm not speaking for all, obviously. Mm-hmm. And I do want to go back on what you said about some things on the education side. But those companies need to do a better job of defining what qualified means.
Yeah, agreed. And so, right now, I think we're in an environment where, particularly in the manufacturing sector, but I do think it's the same in healthcare. It's the same in agriculture. To what degree it's the same, I'm not certain. But again, just anecdotally, I hear that it's similar or the same, which is, at this point, we'll take people who will simply show up for consecutive days on time, right? And we'll come back. And so, companies have for the last couple of years now been relaxing some of the requirements that historically would have been there, but yet they've had to remove them or else they can't find people.
Right.
And so I think what we're looking at is some socio-demographic changes, right? That's one. Second thing I think we're looking at is the way technology has allowed us to work. There are so many more options now for what someone can make money doing.
Right.
Who would have thought 20 years ago that a social media influencer would make a 6-figure a year salary.
Yeah, that's on the small side.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's causing us to redefine what it means to add value to something.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think,
and if you don't mind, I'd like to interject a little bit here.
Sure.
Before I forget. I think part of the problem is too, we've in the past looked at, and even currently, and many organizations still do, look at workforce development as one big bucket.
Yeah.
And, from an analogy, from my perspective, it's a toolbox. You've got to have a plan for workforce development for your new hires.
Yeah.
And pre-hire. So you've got to have a partnership and a network with your high school, with your higher ed, with your certification agencies.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a workforce development plan for your existing workforce.
Yeah.
And you've got to
the people who work for you today.
Right. The entire workforce. You have to understand who you have, what you have, and what skills are going to be, what evolution of skills needs to happen. And you also need to have a workforce development plan for that offboarding. And we talked about that on a previous episode, that knowledge management side. So you have an individual that's been here 30, 40, 50 years. Take the time to identify, not only help them out on their way out, but they'll feel a sense of loyalty, perhaps, to help you to identify things that they've learned along the way that you could apply back to your partners in high school, your partners in higher ed. And then it's just a continual cycle of workforce development improvement.
I also think we need to start looking at workforce development, or at least workforce awareness, career awareness, earlier in a person's life. And I'm not saying that, we want to take third graders and make them pick a career. That's not what I'm saying. But routinely, especially in higher ed, we hear companies lament the fact that, well, we can find people with technical skills, but we can't find them with the quote unquote soft skills, or vice versa. You hear sometimes, right? And the issue is, well, in many cases, where do you begin to learn the basis for some of those technical skills? And where do you begin to learn some of the basis for those softer skills? It's often in elementary school.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a fair bit of research that's been done about when children begin making determinations, or at least having sort of conceptualizations about what they might want to do, when they grow up, so to speak. Yeah. Well, it happens at about age 6 or 7. And, well, why is that? Well, because that is when they often begin to experience the world other than their immediate family, right? They begin going to the doctor, to the dentist, to the whatever. Not that they haven't gone before that, but now they have a level of maturity, a level of experience that they can begin to equate certain things. Why is it that when you ask a child who's that age, what do you want to be when you grow up, right? As if, your job is your be all and your end all, right? Well, they often say things like firefighter, police officer,
astronaut,
nurse, astronaut, doctor, those, a teacher, those kind of, well, why is that? Well, those are often the people they encounter on a day-to-day basis, either in real life or by virtue of stories, right? One of the things from kind of a manufacturing, possibly even ag or healthcare perspective, is we need to do a better job of illuminating to students at increasingly younger ages what kinds of opportunities are out there, what kinds of things, generally speaking, you might need to learn about. I would even say at middle school and at high school, where particularly workforce education starts to become a little more specific and a little more,
if you're lucky, if you're not,
right, and a little more job oriented. But yet, if you've ever toured a manufacturing facility, it can be a little overwhelming,
absolutely,
even for a teenager, right? And then B, they sit you down and have you watch the dreaded safety video, right? Which it doesn't talk to you and get you excited about manufacturing. This is just, here's how all the ways you can die inside this factory. So don't do that.
Don't
you know,
step
and
outside the yellow line.
right. And so what we don't end up doing a good job of, I think from a career readiness or a job readiness perspective, is to talk to potential workers, i.e. students. I'd even say to some degree, the general public, because they may not be that different from students in this regard, but putting it to them in language that they understand.
Yeah.
And in things and in anecdotes or what have you, examples that they can relate to. And I don't think we do a good job of that as an educational community. And it's something that we ought to do more of.
I really like the approach to career readiness, especially when you think about workforce development, but you trace that back into that elementary, junior high, high school, and the higher ed. And I know I'm not supposed to look at the camera, and our partners at Elevate Media are gonna, probably laugh when I do this, but I believe we should bring shop class back. And let me tell you why.
As a requirement?
As an option.
Okay.
When you talk about career readiness, and let's just say you're U.S. freshman through senior year of high school, we've removed a lot of these what used to be required skill offerings, home ec, shop, construction, things that I was required to take. I have a perfect example of this. Just last week, my alternator went bad in my truck, older truck, so I changed it. Purchased one at AutoZone, changed it myself. Had the confidence I could. Can I do it as fast as someone that's a trained mechanic? Absolutely not. Were there frustrations along the way? Yep. But I was able to change it myself. How did I get that knowledge? Sophomore year of high school. I had a class that taught that and walked me through the fundamentals of being a mechanic. Did I choose that as a career? No. It wasn't something that interested me. But the skills I got from that, I still apply today, and personally and professionally. And why I'm saying that is, and again, I'm just one individual, and you touched on it, how one learns and what they need to learn and master a subject. There's a lot of variance there.
For sure. And I would say, I have 3 teenage children, and they've all benefited from going to a school where those kinds of classes were in fact still there.
Good.
In my opinion, some of the difference comes in terms of, is it a requirement or is it an elective? Now, even when I was their age, 30-ish years ago, 35 years ago, there were certain topics that were electives for us. But I will say, on the whole, some of those things were more of a requirement than they were an elective.
Yeah.
And so to your point, this is a much larger evolution that we've had here in this country. And when you talk about, I've said before in a number of different papers and presentations that I've given over the years that, for every industrial revolution we've had as a country, right, and arguably we're in the 4th one right now,
Right.
There's always been this equal and accompanying educational revolution. And right around the second industrial, right, we went from mechanical to electrical, or mechanization to electrification. Let me say it that way. So that was the early or late 1800s, early 1900s. You began to have an educational movement that dealt with something called the manual arts. It's what those of us of a certain age range would have known as industrial arts in junior high and high school. Yeah. And I always say junior high because I was in junior high. I wasn't in middle school, right? That's another one of those evolutions. But the point is this, is that the way that was conceived, that curriculum, and if you look back at the literature, the way that is that every person should know how to do those things. Yeah. And those were some of the earliest instances of actually involving girls and young women into They would have called it vocational studies at the time, not necessarily industrial studies, but into job readiness kinds of things. Now, in slightly after that, in the 1930s and 40s, they began to steer into kind of this different kind of a pathway, right? Where they did begin to differentiate some between boys and girls in classes, and you had things that would have, again, for my generation, would have been like home economics versus, say, auto mechanics, right? Now, most schools didn't, restrict, let's say, a boy or a girl from taking either one. It's just, into some of those social gender norms, you tended to have students picking one track or another. That being said, I can still remember in junior high being in a home ec class where I learned to make a sweatshirt, right? So, but my point,
I could still make a mean pillow,
right? But to my point, I think is that we're now seeing this shift, right? So let's take electric vehicles. That's a topic that's fresh on people's minds these days, right? We're not just talking about the vehicle, right? There is an entire infrastructure, and I'm not necessarily talking about power grid, although that is an issue. But what I'm talking about is an entire infrastructure on platform development, power source, i.e. battery development, right? Charging infrastructure, maintenance infrastructure.
And field maintenance.
All of those things, right? That has to come to fruition in order for the EV market to really, really become mainstream. Right now, I think for a lot of people, it's still this sort of eclectic thing, right? That people do. Although it's rapidly becoming mainstream, right? We're still a little ways from the rest. It's one thing to go off and buy an electric vehicle, right? But it's another thing to make sure that we have a common everyday infrastructure for it that's as common as, say, a corner gas station or a mechanic shop, right?
And you're talking end of life, and that's still missing from a lot of the discussion in the EV market is that industry from a workforce development is going to change as well, because you're talking a whole new set of requirements.
How do you decommission that? Right. How do you recycle it? What do you do with those rare earth metals, right? I mean, the list goes on and on. And so some of the things that we're going to need new workers to know, even for a basic or entry level kind of a job, are going to be really different if those kinds of industries come to fruition the way people hope they might. We're going to need people to know different kinds of things. I think we're going to need them to know more about communications, actually, I believe. I think we're going to need them to know more about systems and systems level thinking. Because actually much of our ability or much of our need, I should say, to have someone be a mechanic is you often could buy individual spare replacement parts, right? If I had something mechanical go out on my car, let's say, like you mentioned an alternator, right? Or maybe you have a pulley go bad on your air conditioner compressor, right? Well, historically, you could replace that bushing or you could replace that pulley. Now you replace the whole air conditioning motor most of the time, right? Same thing for that alternator. You arguably could have fixed an alternator, but you will replace it, right? Because designs of those vehicles have changed in such a way that now those individual bushings and pulleys and the like they're not serviceable parts anymore. Or if they are, well, guess what? You're not buying a $10 part. You're buying a $100 part or whatever, because you're getting the whole assembly now. And so the idea is
that might be the remanufactured price,
right? Yeah, but we need people to begin to know different kinds of things. I mean, math is still important. Being able to write is still important. Being able to, think in complete thoughts and speak in complete sentences is still important, right? But that entry level knowledge of things and stuff, it's going up, right? And it's continuing to increase. And maybe there exists, a scale upon which to measure this kind of stuff. I don't know. Maybe there does. But certainly, as we think about how we conceive of our educational programs, I think, and what we want, just as some general level of literacy as a functioning society, what do we need? Who's making those kinds of decisions? What kinds of supporting structures are we giving, our teachers and our school personnel who, we can't just, for example, fire all the teachers and hire new ones tomorrow, right? That's not how this is going to work. It's the same thing, right? We're not just going to fire all the manufacturing workers and hire new ones tomorrow. Right. Again, not how this is going to work.
Right.
So there has to be a way to support the incumbent workforce. We've spent the majority of this session talking about the pipeline of the workforce, right? What we need to talk about is that pyramid of the workforce that is the existing workforce. Yep. And that's something that to your point earlier, companies sometimes leave that, as an afterthought, right? Absolutely. They lay out, HR lays out these job families, and you might be able to promote through one of those things, but what's the pathway to that? What is the incentive for me to do that?
To me, as a former corporate employee, most of your Fortune 500 companies, the incentives are all similar: 401k, healthcare, daycare, health facility, potentially decent food at the cafeteria.
Right.
But for me, the one that always stuck out is, it's continual education budget per person across the workforce. If you're going to invest in me, to go out and upskill and learn, to me, that's a pretty big incentive to stay. And it also allows me to stay competitive as someone that's been here for a while, because I've been there. As you move throughout your career, you start going, who's coming up behind me, right? It's no different than a leg race. You're trying not to look over your shoulder, but if I don't stay at least in parallel with the trends of today, technology and process, I'm going to be surpassed. And I think when you talk about the incumbent workforce, that's like I started this episode, a lot of organizations truly aren't investing in that.
Right.
And that to me is where priority needs to be placed. To go back on a few episodes ago, we were talking about state and federal investment and innovation in the U.S. Part of the requirement for me would be, if I'm going to give R&D or any type of grant to an organization, part of that needs to be laid out for workforce development. I need to see a strategy and a plan for your incumbent workforce.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I think it's and to be fair, I think a federal level baseline level of skills, while I certainly think it's attainable, I'm not sure whether people would see it as practical.
Yeah.
To be fair, when you go from state to state, many of them have certain economic sectors in their state, and they may not have much of other kinds of economic sectors, right? So doing something at a federal level, especially if it's a mandate, set aside the politics for a minute, it may end up not being as practical as though giving sort of frameworks and potential incentives to states to craft something that would be relevant to them.
And that's where I was kind of heading, being able to assess, where you're at from a state level, even at a local level from a school perspective. And what are we really offering from a career readiness perspective, our student base? What kind of options do they have? Do they have one? Do they have two? Do they have three? And, my experience in a couple local schools that I'm familiar with, not much has changed.
Yeah, and I think that's where, going back to my comment a little bit ago, was was, well, what do we as the citizens of a particular community or state or what have you, what do we want?
Yeah.
You can go back in history for when, formal education started several hundred years ago, right? And generally speaking, one of the main philosophical elements was that, arguably a more educated population is a better population, right? Arguably, we would be more peaceful. We would get along with each other. We would be more economically advantaged, that sort of stuff. Now, I don't think back then, people were thinking about college per se, but, it was, the idea was that a more educated populace was ideal, right? And so as we've watched our educational systems evolve, we've now begun to equate levels of education with some sort of career readiness, with some sort of career trajectory even. Some people would argue that to some degree that's misplaced. That say if a particular company wants to hire people to do a certain thing, well, they should train those people.
Right.
They should be the ones that invest the resources, right? As opposed to the general population, if you will, or the general community investing resources in something that is that specific. So I think, this kind of a discussion is going to cause us to have other related kinds of discussions about what do we as a people want in terms of a level of literacy for our workforce, a level of literacy for our population, right? And formal education, at least at its origins, was really about personal enlightenment, personal growth, right? Yet over time, it's now been conjoined with, for better or for worse, it's been conjoined with this idea of being ready to go do a job of some sort.
Yeah. And I think, Nate, just like you said, that this is going to probably break off into multiple discussions. But as we close out this episode, for me, and I'm going to relate it to, again, just one data point. College for me was about learning how to communicate with at the time, obviously an older adult workforce. It was about structure. But from an education perspective of the classes, the curriculum I took, quite honestly, for the job and the career I've had, I used very little of it. What I will say is when I was hired or as an apprentice and then hired officially in the automotive sector when I first started out, I was given the opportunity to take a pretty extensive certification. It's, for those of you that know my story, it was CM2. And I use that as my baseline for my career because it really was a good aha moment. But it also, and that organization did a good job. They invested at some level for the entire workforce for them to have knowledge.
Yeah.
Not all of them are required to be certified, but there was that knowledge of what CM2 was for this ecosystem. But it gave us a common language.
Right.
And as a young apprentice, as a young salaried individual, I was able to relate with somebody that had been there for 30 years or 40 years and put it in context. And I think that's exactly what you're saying is we need to identify as an organization, as individuals, as a community, as state level, federal level, that level of literacy that we need. And I'm obviously the proponent that the more skilled and educated we could be, the better our society is. I think dumbing down anything we offer is just very foolish.
Yeah.
But Nate, it's been a great conversation. Thanks for joining us again. For our listeners, stay tuned. We have a lot coming, a lot of more episodes to come. But remember, workforce development's not just one bucket. It's a toolbox, and you have to look at it from the perspective as new hires, the incumbent workforce, and even the ones that are, you're offboarding, whether it be attrition or retiring. There's a lot of knowledge there we could filter back in up front. So again, Nate, thanks for joining us. I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Joe. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe and review the show. And for more information on IPX, visit ipxhq.com.